Hello, welcome to the NNPBC webinar on the role of the councils. My name is Sally Thorne, and I'm one of the founders of the Association of Registered Nurses of BC several years ago. Currently, it's vice president, and I'm also a member of the BC Coalition of Nursing Associations board. So I've been involved in some of the conversations coming up to this date, and I'm just very happy to have an opportunity to talk to you all about this today. A change like this for nursing is obviously something that's both terrifying and amazing, and I'm hoping by the end of this webinar you'll be convinced that this is definitely something that we in BC ought to be pursuing. You'll understand a little bit more of the nature of it, why things are moving in the direction that they're doing, and what some of those opportunities are, as well as some of the operational issues that we'll have to do with the question of the councils in particular. Oops, just trying to move my slides forward. There. What I'd like to start with is just reminding you of the three different kinds of nursing organizations. We move so quickly sometimes that we really forget to pay attention that there is a distinct role and need for three different kinds of nursing organizations in BC. We need regulatory bodies to control the approval of schools, to regulate nurses, to set the conditions under which somebody can be entitled to practice this profession. And it's helpful, I think, to think of this as a body that exists to protect the public, to ensure that this function of nursing that's so important to society is safely and properly managed. The union exists in the world to ensure that nurses have safe work conditions, that the issues of work-life practice are well supported, and that's the group that would be the bargaining unit that would engage in contractual relationships with governments and health authorities in order to set the conditions for wages and other conditions of work. So we absolutely need that kind of voice as well. And again, that's not the only thing a union would do, but that would be the core function of the essential existence. The third is the professional association that is also seen as a third pillar of nursing. And this is the place in which the angle of vision that nursing brings to the problems of the world, the health and public policy issues of the day, has an opportunity to come forward. So it speaks about the profession publicly, and it certainly represents that professional lens on how things ought to be different. It speaks out on matters of policy in relation to those things that we as nurses would recognize and understand. So there's a long history of how this coalition came to be, but essentially there were several different groups of nurses, registered psychiatric nurses, licensed practical nurses, and nurse practitioners. In 2013, in relation to a particular problem in which nurse practitioners were being threatened, and the province was deciding potentially to not produce them anymore, this group did come together, and gradually over time it came to involve all of those different professional entities, as well as the Nurse Educators Council of BC. So that history has been told before. I won't tell too much of it again, but this is the group that's come together and over time is now taking the position of formalizing into this new entity. And that brings us all up to today. Today, there are a number of things that are really certain. BC is on the leading edge of change. Other provinces have not yet moved in the direction of bringing all of these groups together. BC is one of the few groups that's actually paid through this coalition a decided effort to try and create the conditions under which nurses could talk together. Those that have been involved in the politics of the nursing world will know that it's been difficult historically for governments and policymakers to bring nursing to the table because there's so many different nursing groups and they don't always get along. And so unfortunately, that's often meant that policies are made in the province without paying attention to nursing because people are a little concerned about getting involved in that difference of opinion. So we're not the only province in which that's been a challenge, but we are one that has that history. We also do know that we've had challenges with working out collaborative practice and figuring out how to work as effectively as we can in the workplace. So this is not an unfamiliar problem, but BC really is in the leading edge of trying to figure out what to do about it. And we have become, through this coalition exercise over the past several years, far, far more collaborative. We fully recognize that the vast majority of issues that nursing would want to bring to public attention are issues that we can all sign on to and we all can stand behind. And we need to be able to do that in a formal way to be able to speak on behalf of this profession. We also know that CNA has been moving over the past decade into a more inclusive structure. So it's not a new idea at all, but it's been one that people are just a little bit hesitant, not necessarily quite ready to give up their autonomy as the separate nursing groups and to join forces together. But what we do know is that CNA will be moving forward. It's seeing with BC that this is the way of the future and seeing that this is a necessary way to move forward. Mike Villeneuve, who is the new CEO of the Canadian Nurses Association, has made it very clear that he sees BC at the vanguard, the kinds of things that we're doing to bring all nurses under the same tent, as being an absolutely mandatory direction for CNA. So it's definitely a trend that we are leading, but we're not the only ones. We expect much of the rest of the country will come forward in this direction. We also know that the BC's three nursing regulatory bodies will merge. By the fall of this year, they will have become one regulatory body, which is a great thing. And frankly, it's one of the things that the coalition has been endorsing and supporting. When we have all of the groups being regulated by one college, we won't any longer have those terrible disjunctures of one group getting the message from the regulatory body that here's the line between one kind of practice and another, and the other having a different group. So there's a lot, particularly in collaborative practice, that will be very much helped by being able to wrestle those issues out and create clarity so that all groups are being given the same message as to who does what, when, and why. And we think that that's unquestionably a really strong force for nurses. So we know that nursing moving forward is our only option. Specifically, we do know that this new one regulatory body isn't very likely to take the position that it would consider fee collection on the basis of one of those groups and not others. We know that we need to come forward together with a plan for that to become an eventuality. But when we work together, that there are so many great things that can happen. And you may be aware of some of these. We're able to stand up and work on policies like the opioid crisis, to stand up and work on things like nursing leadership across the full spectrum, working on building a presence in the ministry, which is a very exciting new development in relation to this, to create that public policy voice where nursing lenses can be put on the major issues of today. Indigenous health being another example. These are great opportunities, and we must move forward because it's the right thing to do, but we also need to move forward in the new environment of this one regulatory body. The guiding principles that the group worked out over time, and the coalition, had an equal representation from each of those bodies of nursing. And it created a set of guiding principles, including absolutely recognizing the individual history, success, and tradition of the separate groups of practical nurses, of registered nurses, of nurse practitioners, of psychiatric nurses. They all have a proud and important history. They have distinctive features of culture and identity, and that there must be a way of preserving that. To engage the membership in figuring out how to put this message forward to make as strong an impact on behalf of nursing in every way. To focus on strong and respected leadership, to be sure that the professional voice of nursing is a constructive voice that's part of making solutions in the province, to bringing forward the ways of knowing that nursing can add to ensure that policy action is informed and has the patient at the heart of it. To have the value of being able to speak on behalf of all nurses in the province and the nursing profession, to be able to be really strategic and come to the table constructively where important matters of decision making and policy are concerned. We also obviously agreed we need to trust each other in the process. What we learned over time is the more you talk it out, if there seems to be a difference of opinion, the more you get to those core values of nursing that really energized us all and made us absolutely confident that we can work together. We can create a unified position where something's quite important, and we can have our differences and celebrate them where we need to do that as well. So we know that nursing does need to be a catalyst for change. We've not historically been able to fully capitalize on the opportunities that are there, and that this is going to become a way of really strengthening that process. So we're really recognizing that these issues of thinking of us all equally, we are all invested in the future of nursing, and that we all need to be part of this. We each have our autonomous identity in our groups, and perhaps even individually as nurses, and all of that's part of what we're celebrating. So a tricky issue was actually, a very tricky issue for that group was figuring out what the name was to be. It sounds like it ought to be self-evident, but that group went through all kinds of possible incarnations of names. It was quite attracted actually to something like the Nursing Professions of BC, but that would have sounded like that would have been NPBC, which sounds like the nurse practitioner group that exists. So there were lots of practical, technical details that caused certain names to be not as appealing at this point in time. But the name that it eventually landed on was Nurses and Nurse Practitioners of BC, NNPBC. And that recognizes that all of the groups, registered nurses, practical nurses, psychiatric nurses, can comfortably speak of themselves and represent themselves as nurses. Nurse practitioners actually have a different requirement to articulate themselves as nurse practitioner, and in fact, it could be argued that they're being a little bit misleading if they were to say to somebody, "I'm your nurse today." So they are different, and they are also the only group that has really been threatened ever since their onset in this province, since they became legal in 2005. They have yet to be able to negotiate a funding model. There's still forces in this province that are trying to prevent nurse practitioner practice because they don't like that level of nurses being autonomous. So there's a number of reasons where showcasing and demonstrating pride in that professional group was something that was agreed upon by all members. And so that's what the coalition eventually came forward with. Now, we're also aware that it doesn't necessarily sit right immediately with all people, particularly those who are nurse practitioners. So we encourage you to wrestle with it and think about it. We've heard a little pushback on that, but we know most of the groups we've talked to actually, when they wrestle with it and think about it, say, you know, I actually do understand the reason. I can accept that as a reason. And in fact, all of us are proud that we have nurse practitioners and a vibrant nurse practitioner practice in this province. And we probably all want to work toward ensuring we've got more of that. We still have 15% of our population doesn't have access to primary care, and nurses and nurse practitioners will be part of that solution. That's a big objective for the future of this organization. So that's the name we've come to, and that I think we have some agreement that if over the course of the next few years it doesn't turn out to be the right name, the group certainly can revisit it. So if you are inclined to want to have input into that, absolutely, but just know that that kind of question's been raised. What we do find, though, is that the vast majority of groups, after they've thought about it and wrestled with it a while and thought about what some of the alternatives might be, a string of names with all of our designations or something like that, they've come to realize that this doesn't sound like a bad option. And I think people have actually come to love it. So your input will continue to be welcome on that. The governance model is a really important part of how this is all going to work. This new entity, NNPBC, will be the sort of formal voice on behalf of nursing. That will be the major entity that the regulatory body and the government reference and refer to as the Association of Nurses, the Professional Association for BC. But it is going to be constructed of councils that represent the individual regulatory groups. So there will be an RN council, a Registered Psychiatric Nurses Council, a Nurse Practitioners Council, and a Licensed Practical Nurse Council, each of which will choose 2 among their members who will sit on the NNPBC board. In addition, there's going to be 4 other members, somebody representing the Nurse Educators Council of BC. Nurse Educators Council is all the heads and directors of all the schools of all designations, so the educational enterprise is clearly an important part of all of us. We all thrive because we get a new crop of new nurses coming into the system every year. We're going to have a public representation, which is standard practice and good practice when we serve the public on a board. We're going to have a student also representing the voice of the future. And we are going to have a designated seat for an Indigenous nurse. That individual will be drawn from the 4 councils, each of which we are proposing will have an Indigenous nursing seat. Now, you may know that the Association of Registered Nurses of BC has had an elected First Nations, and now called Indigenous nursing seat, for some time, very successfully. In recognition of that being, this is Canada 2018, this is a high priority for all of us in our country and in healthcare, and it's going to be into the future. So it's a recognition that those issues of indigeneity that are so terribly important to health equity in our country and in our province are going to stay on the table. And there always will be somebody who's been elected by the members to represent that voice. So that's the structure for now. It may shift over time. There are other groups that are indicating they'd sure love a seat on the board, but the general feeling is that going too much more than 12 could make for a very large and unwieldy board. We all recognize other organizations have ceased to be functional because they've created boards that are way too large to be able to function. So this is likely the general structure that things will take. Now, the specific purpose of this webinar is to talk to you not just about the general organizational structure, but to drill down a little bit into those councils. And the reason for that is that those are the ways in which all of us will have specific input through our own designation into the affairs of the whole. So the councils are going to be the representative group that is specifically called on to advocate for and represent the interests of each of those designations. They will hold elections for those council members each year, very much like the Association of Registered Nurses has done for many years now. And all of the councils will have the benefit of that infrastructure to be able to hold elections in which all of the members across the province have an opportunity to run for election and have an opportunity to vote. The councils may have slightly different numbers of membership, partly because they've all been functioning. Each of the groups has functioned in its own way, and to preserve its way of being. If it currently has 10 members, it'll probably stay with 10 members. And if it's had 6, then it might continue with 6. But those numbers aren't going to be fixed in this decision. Those will evolve over time. The members will be elected, and they will be encouraged to run their elections in such a way that the geographical regions are represented. We ensure that we're not missing key voices like the North or the interior of Vancouver Island. And these are issues that, because the Association of Registered Nurses worked them out and created a way of doing that that's been quite effective, that'll be offered to the other groups to consider as well. Each of them, as I said, will also include one seat that is held as an Indigenous nursing representative. That individual will not simply be coming only to talk about Indigenous issues. They'll be a fully participating board member, but they will be a way of ensuring, a very symbolic and functionally meaningful way of ensuring that we never lose sight of the importance of that particular issue for the health of our population going forward. Now, each of those councils will then identify a couple of people who will sit on the Nurses and Nurse Practitioners of BC board, the sort of overall overarching association board, and they will elect them or appoint them. It may or may not be their council chairs. They will make their own decision about who's best positioned to sit in on those boards. They will administer a budget. Each of the councils will have its own budget to ensure that it can run meetings. It can bring its members in for face-to-face meetings from around the province if it needs to. It will do the work that it needs to be able to do on behalf of that regulatory designation. And so the general way those councils will function will be much the way the ARNBC, which is the one that has been most fully developed in the sense of infrastructure, they'll have the full advantage of that kind of capacity to function. They'll also have significant roles and responsibilities. The councils are all going to be responsible for guiding the overarching NNPBC in managing the details and complexities surrounding the profession. I can tell you from being on the ARNBC board for quite a long time that much of what that group has done has been to think about issues on behalf of nursing in general, not just specifically registered nursing. And I feel very sure that all of the councils will continue to keep an eye on what are those issues of health and public policy that we as nurses ought to be speaking on. So each council will continue to be keeping its eye out, to making an argument for where the attention of nursing ought to be. What should be our high priority policy areas in the coming year? Where should we be making a difference? So all of that will continue. They will also obviously pay particular attention to reviewing and identifying and discussing any practice and policy issues that might impact their designation in particular. So I'm imagining, for example, that the Registered Nurses Council might become particularly alarmed if the government decided it wanted to challenge baccalaureate as entry to practice. So that's an issue that might be specific to one group that it might want to bring the entire board into. But it would bring the expertise in that issue to the table. So the councils are kind of going to be an oversight body that makes sure that the needs and sensibilities of any of the individual designations are never lost in the conversation. We're not going to be putting forward a general policy direction without thinking about how that might affect one or another of our groups. And they will be the sources of ideas for that larger group to be working on. The Nursing Education Council of BC is going to be responsible for guiding and informing NNPBC about what issues are emerging, what's on the landscape with regard to challenges and threats and opportunities in nursing education. And then working with the staff, the councils are going to be tasked with determining that strategic direction. So they'll be funneling up ideas as to what the strategic direction for the whole group ought to be, identifying emerging issues that come up in their particular domain, and determining how to incorporate their profession into the programs and services and recommendations that the entire nursing profession puts forward. We're going to have elections on an annual basis. The nomination and election process for the councils are going to occur at the same time of year, with the exception of the current societies, because some of them are already registered societies as they are transitioning into the new entity. So this year we're going to be in the process of transitioning groups that exist in somewhat different forms into these new councils. The elections are going to be run by the staff. I'm talking about the staff that is currently employed by the Association of Registered Nurses of BC and is working on behalf of the council of the coalition of all of these associations, and will be merging into being the staff of the Nurses and Nurse Practitioners of BC. So we will have a really robust election system with a full slate of candidates, the opportunity to review candidates, an election form that's enabled by each member who holds the appropriate regulatory status, receiving a PIN that will allow them to only vote for the candidates that represent their profession. So practical nurses will be voting for licensed practical nurses, registered nurses for registered nurses, and so on. Those who hold dual registration, who belong to more than one category, and there are some in this province, will have a platform which actually enables them to vote for both of the councils that they belong to. The councils are going to be working really hard to ensure that they either have seats designated by region or that they have a robust slate of nominees representing the regions, so that we are sure that we are fully able to speak to the needs as they're surfacing in nursing around the province. We will have a 2-year term for each of the members of council, ensuring that the councils have an opportunity to consider who to put forward to the board, the bigger board, and then what region they're from. So that all of these issues, to be sure that the councils and the overarching board are representative of the designations, the province, and other kinds of issues that emerge over time. There's going to be also some interface between these councils. There may be issues that the licensed practical nurses and registered nurses, for example, decide this is an issue we really want to work on together. We're going to create and develop a policy framework and try and sell it now to the entire group and say, is this something that can be said on behalf of the group? So I think that there will be lots of conversation between the councils where something bubbles up that might be of concern to the registered psychiatric nurses. They might want to put out feelers and say, here's a conversation we're having. Would you like to have somebody sit on this working committee? So these are the kinds of ways in which we see considerable interface between the councils. In addition, of course, the NNPBC board itself will become aware, because it will always have the representation of all of those groups. And I should go back. I did forget to mention the question of proportional representation. Some nurses have raised that question. Why did we have equal numbers of all of the groups, and why not proportional representation? It's come up in many questions. Well, if you do the math and try and figure out what it would look like to represent one group that might have 30,000 and another group that might have 2,500 members or 500 members, then you realize actually proportional representation is quite impossible, and you would be caught in a whole challenge of trying to figure out either how large a board you would have or how you would possibly represent that. Can you put in 1/8 of a voice, for example? So when you realize that it's like technically impossible, then you say, well, what is the higher value? That we all ensure that we're all there in the room, that each of the groups has a representative, and that those representatives are chosen by the council as individuals who will be able to effectively listen to, respond to, speak up, and advocate for their issues. And if they're not satisfied that that's happening, they can replace that council member. So that we really feel very strongly, based on several years now of having that kind of equal representation model around the council table, the coalition table, that really is a very, very healthy and productive way to develop relationships, to talk through hard issues, to build some agenda. And so that's why the groups will be equal, even though we know the numbers of nurses in the different regulatory groups aren't equal now, and we have no idea what will happen in the future. But before I leave this slide, just to underscore the idea that the councils will focus on their own designated group issues, and they'll also be very involved in the issues among and between councils and collectively with all of the councils and the overarching board. The board is going to be the governance body over the whole, which means it'll hold the responsibility for overseeing staff, figuring out where the group meets, dealing with some of the partnering arrangements, some of the very complex and important government relations and other kinds of conversations and strategies and functions that very much need to happen on behalf of the profession, and that we have been able to do over the years and build up over the years with the ARNBC in particular, because that's the only group of these that has had an infrastructure and staff. So that will now be located at the NNPBC board, and it will make decisions about strategic priorities. It may allocate budget to the licensed practical nurses or the registered psychiatric nurses if there's an issue that they need to take on and want to take leadership on in any given year. But that will be the group that really looks at the collective strategy and organizes it. The 4 councils will be running their regular elections for those wishing to be those board members, and we will have an appointment process for the other seats, the student seat, the public representative. The Nursing Education Council, of course, will identify from its own executive who it would like to be the appropriate member. And there will be a certain set of standing committees that are struck by this group, by the transitional board as we transition, and then the full board over time. Things like finance and nominations and governance and the sorts of things that a large organization typically needs to have its board members fully represented on. At the first meeting after the board turnover, the board's going to develop a competencies matrix, which is going to figure out who all's there and how it best organized, as well as whether there are any aspects of regions or activities that it's not continuing. So this board will examine itself and position itself to be able to do the work, to take the work of managing the organization off the council so that they can focus their attention on the issues of strategy and priority on behalf of their regulatory entities and on behalf of the profession. So where we're moving with this really is an exciting opportunity to bring all the nurses together in one strong collaborative nursing association to be able to speak as one voice on those matters of public and health policy, where nursing sees a way forward that would make a difference for the health of the population from a very specific nursing lens, the thing that we all share, that ability to see the world in a certain way and to understand what life is like for patients at the interface. And we'll be able to come forward in a manner that shows that unity and shows that coherent vision so that we can fully represent that on behalf of the people of this province. So I'm going to stop at this point and see if there are any questions from the group. Okay, I see some questions. The first one that's come to me is, how can you ensure that one council doesn't become dominant and that their needs don't overtake the board table? Well, that's a very good question. We do know that the numbers of registered nurses in British Columbia is dramatically larger than the numbers of any of the other organizations, and that registered nurses have had a particular kind of association organization that has developed more strongly than the others have over the past few years. I'm talking about the professional association in particular. They all have bargaining units, and they all have a regulatory oversight. But it is going to be very important that around that board table there are an equal number of all groups. So if the agendas that seem to be bubbling up seem more registered nurse oriented or seem more nurse practitioner oriented, there will be strong and capable individuals representing the other regulatory groups that are able to see that and bring it back and bring their councils into the conversation. What we found when we've done this and wrestled with this over the several years in the coalition is that so many of the issues, the vast majority of the issues that we are concerned about and want to engage with are in fact overarching issues. When you start to look at something like the opioid crisis, you don't start to say, now do NPs see it a little bit differently than RPNs? No. We each bring something to the table, we enrich something to the table, but we have had so few times when those fundamental policy directions would not be unanimously and enthusiastically supported by all groups. So the board will have individuals representing these various groups, but it will not be dominated by any group. And I think that fundamental overarching value that the board has been built on, that all of our voices count and all of our perspectives count, will continue to be a strongly held value in this organization. We also know that the rest of the country will be watching, and other provinces may be a bit hesitant and have the natural hesitations that groups have if they haven't been together over time of what that would look like. So we do feel that we have an obligation to demonstrate that constructive, hard action, that capacity for unity is something that we can really develop. And we've become quite good. If we do find we have a little issue that we see a bit differently, we've found that we can have frank and open conversation in a respectful and professional manner, really wrestle it out and try and come up with the best answer that will serve all groups. So having had that experience, the delight of having that experience over the past while, I think everybody who has been on that coalition board would agree with that position. Are there any more questions? Not yet seeing any on the question. What I'm hoping is that all of you who are listening will take the opportunity to go into the website that's showing on the screen right now, to look at the videos and hear many of the people who have been involved talking about why they think this is an important initiative, what it means to them, why they're signed on to it. Look to the frequently asked questions. Those are the questions that we know people have been asking, and so we provided some answers that we think people can benefit from. Absolutely get involved in the consultation. There are many ways in which your questions, your comments, your opinions will be heard, and we will ensure that that site stays interactive so that it's listening to and responding to those questions. Encourage your colleagues to get involved. This is the most exciting thing that has happened in professional nursing in BC in 100 years, and it's something that could change the face of Canadian nursing. We know that CNA is recognizing the writing on the wall. It will need to move to a group, and it will celebrate moving to a group that includes everyone. It will refer to BC as the energy that pushed that direction to move more quickly than it might have. Things sometimes take a long time to change. And the rest of the country will look to that. This represents an opportunity for nursing to take its rightful place around those policy tables, the rightful place in shaping the direction of healthcare in British Columbia and in shaping the public understanding of what the role and contribution of nursing is. So obviously, I feel it's a wonderful opportunity. We need to make sure it goes well, it goes as successfully as possible. And part of that is consultation to involve as many nurses as possible. So if you're listening now or in the recorded webinar, I really, really encourage you to try and do your part to bring this to the attention of your colleagues, have a coffee table discussion, get people involved online, follow the Twitter feed, Facebook, any other mechanism that you're familiar with. It's been a wonderful treat for me to have an opportunity. Oops, I'm sorry, I've got another question. It's finally come up on my screen. With the formation of NNPBC, what would happen to the nursing specialties of BC? That's a great question. The NNPBC will probably continue to do many of the functions that ARNBC has been trying to build up over these years, but that the specialties would not necessarily be designation specific. So while we might now be able to create really good infrastructure to support nurses in palliative care with some of the initiatives that they're working on, then those now would move to include that broader tent of nurses from across the designations that are working in those specialties. So there's loads of room for those specialties to continue, and we'll continue to consult with members about how best to do it. We started with specialty networks. That in some cases that was great, other cases may not have been the best way to bring groups together. There is absolutely no question in anybody's mind that although we have a focus on nurse practitioners in the name and they're highlighted in a certain way, that in bringing up the number and the nature of clinical nurse specialists in this province is absolutely fundamental to the health of the population. That has eroded over years. We're very, very aware of that. And I think that will absolutely be a high priority for the new NNPBC. It's clearly been articulated by the coalition. It's clearly been articulated in the work that's done in nursing leadership. And CNSs exist at the clinical face to advance system-wide leadership, including knowledge generation and uptake, mentorship support, advancing the structures for clinical practice. So there is absolutely no question that working with and strengthening the nursing specialties, helping nurses be able to get their certification with CNA, these are all very much parts of what will be high priority projects for the new group. Another question's risen. I heard that BCNU is suing CRNBC for some reason. Never heard of what the reason was, but wonder if you've heard anything about this. Yes, unfortunately we have. The BCNU has 3 times over the course of ARNBC's history launched a lawsuit, and in some of those CRNBC has been named as well. It is a little bit difficult to understand why one body of nursing would be challenging another body of nursing in this manner. I think for many of us in the profession, it doesn't seem a particularly professional way to resolve differences rather than sitting around a table. I think that the reasons for the lawsuits are really to try and challenge the association's capacity to represent nurses. It seems that there's an interest in being the voice for nursing as opposed to accepting the idea that there's a need for multiple nursing organizations. So, you know, I, as an individual who's been involved in this, this isn't the time or place to go into a lot of detail, but I can safely say that there are no infractions or anything that you would need to know about to lose confidence in your profession, but that these issues are things that the group will continue to work on and will continue to wrestle with for some time. We hope that the nurses of the province will encourage its union to say, this is not how we solve issues. Let's be clear about what our differences of opinion might be. Let's sit around a table and sort it out. I'm very hopeful that we will be able to take that road going forward, and I hope the nurses of BC will agree. I see another question. How will the Indigenous Director work? I like it that it fits with the terms of reference, but I'm interested in hearing how you'll ensure it's not a token position. Oh, what a great question. It is true that sometimes such positions have been put on boards and the individual attends and the group doesn't really change its agenda or respond to them. That is absolutely not the philosophy that we will have. And you may be aware, if you go on the ARNBC website, we have had an Indigenous seat for some time. We have treasured the value that has brought with regard to our sensibility and consciousness, our sense of strategy. We've engaged quite strongly on issues of Aboriginal health. And we've articulated a policy for how we engage that way, specifically that we do not leave to that one individual the responsibility for all direction in Aboriginal health. We absolutely see it as a shared board responsibility that we all attend to that issue. We think about it in relation to the policies that we create and the strategies that we create. We're mindful of how we bring in Indigenous wisdom into our processes, Indigenous nurses into our strategy, Indigenous populations into anything that we might do that would affect them. Nothing about them without them. At the same time, just because we have such a board member and we have it high on our strategy, we are never going to stop and say this has been solved. We've solved that problem. We recognize that for the rest of our lifetime, this will be an issue for Canada, for nursing, for this province, and we will do our best to ensure that when it comes time for elections of those positions, that we really talk to our colleagues to ensure that the message gets out to suitable potential board members, that people are strongly encouraged to run, that we bring great voices into that role, and that role continues to play a really important part of our collective thinking. At the same time, we have no interest in pigeonholing those individuals on our board to say, you're only relevant to the conversation around Indigenous health. We expect them to engage vigorously and thoughtfully in seniors' health, in rural health, in every single issue that we do, and that we will continue to do that. I think as well that an interesting new dimension of this is that we will have 4 designations that will each have an Indigenous representative, and among those 4, that group will decide who among them will sit on the NNPBC board. So that tells us that that group of 4 Indigenous nurses will, and nurses who represent that Indigenous issue, that group will meet together and collectively support certain policies. If it starts to feel we're slipping collectively on some matter, it will have a group then to wrestle those issues with and make sure they're expressed. So I think this new model will ensure that this isn't a token and it's actually quite relevant. I see another question in the system. Can the councils be any size they decide to be? For example, could the RN Council have more people on it, given that there's more RNs in the province? Absolutely it could. Right now, it's functioning with 10 members, and it has felt that that's actually a pretty good size because people actually who run for election run because they're prepared to take it seriously, to give up the time to be able to do this as on a voluntary board basis, to be able to devote time to preparation of materials, to engaging in teleconferences and nursing activities, so they're maintaining really good levels of being informed. And I think that we have sometimes seen in the nursing profession groups that get to be 30 or 50 and nobody takes a sense of responsibility. So if a group did decide that they wanted to go much larger or much smaller than the rest, they could do that within some limits. Obviously, there's going to be budgetary limits, and we probably couldn't afford for them to fly 100 people from around the province on a regular basis. But within those budgetary limits, they will be able to make their own choice. And the next question is, how will the president of the NNPBC board be chosen and by whom? Will members have a choice in who this person is? Great question. What we have decided at this point is that the members of that board will be brought on through the election by the councils and the appointment and the processes I told you about. And then that group, that council itself, will identify its president. So the president will not be directly elected by the members, but will be chosen by a group that is dominated by 2/3 of that group are the elected members of the elected members. So you can see it filtering up from the thousands of nurses of a designation have voted for their board. Their board has now chosen its 2 delegates to this council, and that council together will identify its president. So that's how that position will be chosen. The next question is, what happens when councils are in disagreement about an issue or something that they think the big organization should do? Well, we're anticipating that there may be disagreements about that at some point, and although there aren't formal mechanisms worked out to say under this circumstance you do this and under this circumstance you do this, we know that is what the larger board will be wrestling with in the first couple of years of its existence, to ensure that in its bylaws and policies and in its guidelines that there will be ways for every council to ensure that if they have an issue that they think is not being attended to and they think is vitally important, that it at least comes to a larger group. Now, I can envision, it's not been set in stone yet, but personally, I can certainly envision issues of a particular kind of complexity or importance that might allow us at some point to bring all of the groups, all the councils and all of the association board together, to have a conference, to have an assessment, to bring in experts, to really wrestle through complex issues together. So I think we will have the flexibility of multiple issues. If we did get into a fundamental disagreement, and I can't think of what that would be. Maybe we would have an issue of the educational level that should go forward. Maybe one group should say its entry to education should be at a higher level, and maybe the educators might say, no, we can't do that. So should we have different groups, different differences of opinion. I think we will have the resources now to bring in expertise, to look to other provinces, to look to other jurisdictions, to look to CNA, to bring in resources where we need them, and to figure out a solution forward. But what's going to be the beauty of this is that that debate and disagreement does not have to take place in the public domain. We don't have to erode the public confidence in this most trusted profession of ours. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be having those conversations politely, in an informed way, professionally, and they can be vigorous and lively, but still professional. We do that behind closed doors. We wrestle with it. And then we decide what will be our public face. Is this an issue that we're divided enough that we should not take a public statement on behalf of nursing? Or is this one that we can say, we have some differences within our groups, but the majority of us feel this? So I feel very, very confident that we will find really creative, strategic solutions that are meaningful and allow us to function without airing some of that unnecessary difference in public. And the huge value of that is that we know governments are so much more likely to invite us to the table if they feel that we will do that work ourselves, not force them to try and choose among us. So that's the basis for the optimism I have about this wonderful new enterprise. I realize we're getting very close to the end of the time. And oh, I see one more question. I'll answer one more question before I close up. How does the public representative engage with the councils, or do they only engage at the board level? That's a really great question. I don't think that a formal answer has been worked out on that one. I think that we're very excited by ensuring that we do have a public representative on the board for the reasons that boards do, to ensure that there's at least one person in the room that can step outside of an invested nursing perspective and say, hey, wait a minute, you know, this is going on behalf of the public. We're going to want to choose really strong and capable advocates for the public, people who will ask the hard questions that a nurse might not think to ask in certain situations. And I do believe that those public representatives will be available to the councils to bring those kinds of ideas forward to them as well. The details of that role, I honestly have not seen. There may be others who have worked on that, but it's a great question. And I just think that it's another example of the many opportunities that we have as we go forward and deal with the big questions of structure and function and governance. When we deal with these big questions, we'll have lots of opportunity to continue to work and massage and receive input on all of these issues of how we operate. And if we find we didn't quite get it right the first level, these are issues that we can continue to develop and build and evolve, which is actually the way organizations naturally move. I now don't see any more questions, and I'm going to take that as an appropriate time to wind down. Reiterate, please get involved, please stay involved, please get excited about the opportunity that we have here, and encourage your colleagues to get involved. Help them understand it's worth spending a little time to become informed, have input, express your view, and absolutely when we get to the point of having those elections, put your name forward if you're interested. Vote for those people who are putting their names forward and get involved with all of us. Thank you so much for listening this far. It's been a joy for me to be involved in this process and to have an opportunity to talk to you about it today. Thank you.